No one planned a war that day. The morning air over Massachusetts carried only the ordinary sounds of spring. Boots on damp ground whispered orders, the rustle of leaves. Yet within those quiet moments, something irreversible was forming. Men who did not know they were about to shape a continent stood facing one another, uncertain, tense, bound by duty, fear, and habit. History often announces itself without ceremony, and on that morning it arrived almost unnoticed. The year was 1775, and the place was the countryside west of Boston, a region of small towns, farms, and winding roads shaped by generations of colonial life. The British Empire, under King George III, ruled over 13 North American colonies stretching from Georgia to New Hampshire. These colonies had been founded over more than a century, built by settlers who cleared land, raised families, traded goods, and governed themselves locally while remaining subjects of the British Crown. By the spring of 1775, the relationship between Britain and its colonies had grown strained, not yet broken, but pulled taut by years of disagreement. At the center of imperial authority stood George III, monarch of Great Britain since 1760. He ruled from London, surrounded by ministers, advisors, and parliament, overseeing an empire that spanned oceans. Britain had recently emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that left it dominant in North America but deeply in debt. Protecting newly won territories required troops, forts, and supplies, all of which cost money. London looked to the colonies, beneficiaries of British defense, to help share that burden. New taxes and regulations followed, passed by Parliament and enforced by royal officials. From the British perspective, these measures were legal and measured, consistent with the authority of a sovereign state. From the colonial perspective, they felt distant and imposed, decided by men across the ocean who did not live with their consequences. Colonial assemblies protested, merchants organized boycotts, and pamphlets circulated through towns and taverns. The arguments were complex and varied, often centered on representation, rights, and long-standing practices of local governance. Loyalty to the crown remained common, but it existed alongside growing frustration and suspicion. Boston became a focal point of tension. As one of the largest and most politically active ports in the colonies, it drew the attention of British authorities. British troops were stationed in the city to enforce customs laws and maintain order. Their presence was visible and constant, a reminder of imperial power in streets where civilian life continued as it always had. Incidents accumulated over time, arguments, scuffles, protests, each small on its own, but together forming an atmosphere of unease. Trust eroded slowly, replaced by watchfulness on both sides. By 1774, colonial resistance had become more organized. Representatives from several colonies gathered in Philadelphia at what became known as the First Continental Congress, coordinating responses to British policies and asserting shared grievances. In Massachusetts, local militias, citizen soldiers long established for defense, began drilling more regularly. They were not a standing army, but farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who kept muskets at home and trained part-time. British officials watched these developments with concern, unsure whether they represented preparation for rebellion or simply heightened vigilance. The desire of British leadership was clear: to restore order and assert authority without provoking widespread violence. The empire depended on coherence, on the principle that laws passed in London applied throughout British territories. Allowing one region to openly defy that authority raised fears of precedent, not only in America but across the empire. At the same time, many in Britain hoped force could be avoided, that a display of strength would be enough to calm resistance and bring the colonies back into compliance. The obstacle lay in distance and misunderstanding. Orders sent from London took weeks to arrive. Conditions on the ground shifted faster than policy could adapt. Local British commanders had to interpret broad directives while responding to immediate realities. In Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, both military governor and commander-in-chief, faced growing unrest with limited options. Arresting colonial leaders risked inflaming tensions. Ignoring militia preparations risked losing control altogether. Each choice carried consequences. By April 1775, British intelligence indicated that colonial militias were stockpiling weapons and ammunition in towns outside Boston, particularly in Concord. Gage authorized a limited operation, a nighttime march to seize these supplies and assert authority. The plan was not conceived as the beginning of a war. It was intended to be swift, controlled, and decisive, an action meant to prevent conflict, not ignite it. About 700 British regulars were chosen for the mission, experienced soldiers trained for discipline and order. Word of the expedition, however, did not remain secret. Riders moved through the countryside, alerting militia leaders that British troops were on the march. Church bells rang, signals were passed, and men gathered as they had been trained to do. By the time British forces reached the town of Lexington in the early hours of April 19, they found a small group of militia assembled on the green. These men were not uniformed soldiers in the European sense. They stood as neighbors and townsmen, armed but uncertain, awaiting developments. What happened next unfolded in moments and remains partly obscured by conflicting accounts. Orders were shouted. Someone fired a shot, its origin unclear, its intent unknown. The sound broke the tension that words could not resolve. British troops fired a volley. When the smoke cleared, several militia members lay wounded or dead. The British continued on toward Concord, where they searched for supplies, finding little of what they sought. At the North Bridge, militia forces confronted them again, this time in greater numbers. Shots were exchanged and British soldiers fell. As British troops began their return march to Boston, the situation changed decisively. Militia units from surrounding towns converged along the roads, firing from behind trees, stone walls, and buildings. The disciplined formation of British regulars, effective on open battlefields, was strained by the terrain and the relentless pressure. The retreat became chaotic at times, marked by exhaustion, confusion, and mounting casualties. By the time reinforcements escorted the troops back into Boston, the day had cost lives on both sides. The shift from political dispute to armed conflict had occurred without declaration, without ceremony. News of the fighting spread rapidly through the colonies. What had begun as a localized operation was now understood as something larger. Militia forces mobilized across New England, surrounding Boston. Colonial leaders faced decisions they had long debated in theory, but now confronted in reality. British authorities, too, had to reckon with the fact that force had been used, blood had been shed, and restraint alone would not restore the previous order. In London, reports arrived weeks later, filtered through official dispatches and personal letters. The events at Lexington and Concord were interpreted in different ways. Some saw them as unfortunate incidents, others as open rebellion. King George III and Parliament were forced to reassess the situation. The possibility of reconciliation still existed, but it narrowed with each passing day. Once armed resistance became organized. Restoring authority required greater commitment, more troops, and a willingness to sustain a prolonged conflict. The months that followed saw the rapid escalation of hostilities. The Second Continental Congress convened, assuming responsibility for coordinating colonial defense. George Washington was appointed commander of a newly formed Continental Army. In Boston, British forces found themselves besieged, their control limited to the city itself. Each side moved forward cautiously, aware that the stakes had risen beyond what anyone had intended that April morning. The first shots did not create independence on their own. They did not resolve the deep disagreements between Britain and its colonies. What they did was remove the space for ambiguity. After Lexington and Concord, neutrality became harder to maintain. Individuals and communities were drawn into choices they might have preferred to avoid. Allegiances shifted, families divided, and the conflict took on a momentum shaped as much by necessity as by ideology. Over time, the war expanded beyond New England, drawing in foreign powers and stretching across years of hardship. The initial encounters, modest in scale by later standards, took on symbolic weight as the opening moments of a larger struggle. They were remembered not because of their size, but because of their timing, because they marked the moment when disagreement crossed into violence and return became uncertain. The historical impact of that day is measured not only in political outcomes, but in the transformation of ordinary lives. Farmers became soldiers. Towns became supply centers. Ideas debated in print were tested under fire. For Britain, the conflict revealed the limits of imperial control in an age of distance and growing colonial identity. For the colonies, it forced a reckoning with the responsibilities and costs of resistance. No one planned a war that day, but by its end, a path had been set that would reshape North America and alter the course of global history. The first shots did not echo because they were loud, but because they were final in one essential way. They marked the end of an old understanding and the beginning of a future that would have to be built, slowly and imperfectly, from the consequences of that morning.